Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session on content moderation. In recent years, the need for content moderation has exponentially grown. Wellbeing support has traditionally focused on the provision of therapeutic intervention, such as counseling and EAP services, with the addition to resiliency training. However, this model is somewhat outdated. So today we're going to take a step back and look at the human experience of content moderation and the exposure to graphic and sensitive content, and then take a look forward to how we can improve on the current wellbeing model by providing increased psychological health and safety in the workplace for content moderators. This webinar is filmed in two parts. In the first part, I'm joined by Joe Galvin, a journalist, and Dr. Jackie Wilmhurst, a risk and resilience psychologist. And in the second part, I'm joined by Dr. Marielle Basketball. We hope you enjoy today's session, and if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to myself, Davina, at zevohealth.com to answer any of the questions that you might have. Thank you and enjoy. I'm joined right now by Joe Galvin and Dr. Jackie Wilmhurst. Joe is a journalist for the investigative nonprofit The Outlaw Ocean Project, and prior to that, he was the managing editor at the social media news agency Storyful, where he led a global team of journalists to cover major breaking stories for over 100 newsrooms worldwide. Dr. Jackie Wilmhurst is the co-founder and director of Safety and Mind Consultancy, which specializes in psychological health and safety in the workplace. And with a background in both research and practice, she's highly experienced with and trusted by the media industry, especially social media companies and their partners. I'm Davina Ramkasoon, Health and Wellbeing Director at Zevo Health. So welcome both Joe and Jackie. It's great to have you here today. Joe, I'm going to go to you first and just speak to you about your experiences as a journalist, because you've been exposed to a wide range of content and you've worked hard to raise this awareness around vicarious trauma in previous workplaces. So would you be able to share with us some of your experiences that you've had as a journalist and how exposure to graphic content has maybe impacted yourself and your teams?
Sure, yeah. So I joined a company called Storyful back in 2012, and at the time it was the world's first social media news agency, and it was very much a field of journalism that was in its infancy at that stage. We were one of the very few, we were really the only newsroom that was dedicated just working through social media, and there was very few even units that were focused on it. The BBC UGC hub came a little bit later, but we were very early on in the trend. Now, of course, every newsroom has their social media kind of unit within the company doing all kinds of amazing things. But I suppose we were a young team, and it was at that time, and I suppose where we cut our teeth was the Arab Spring, particularly the Syrian civil war. And what we found very early is that we were being exposed to, extreme, violence and extremely graphic content, if not on a daily basis, on a regular basis. So we were in kind of new territory, especially as a young team, and it quickly became apparent that, this was a real challenge for journalists to face, but it wasn't really one that we had a good understanding of how to deal with it. And in fairness to Storyful and the team at the time, and the team was led by Mark Little, who was a former journalist, we did try to take steps quite early on to tackle this. We did some work with the Dart Centre and Bruce Shapiro, for example, who would be specialists in the subject. Access to employment assistance was instituted quite early on. But even so, it was still something we were learning all the time. And I suppose as I grew into my role at Storyful, became a manager myself, it became more and more apparent that this was something that needed to be a core consideration when managing a team of journalists who were working on social media. I mean, the volume of content you're dealing with on a daily basis is a challenge. And I suppose, relentlessness, I think, is one of the key things. You can, I suppose, casually or occasionally see violent content online, and that's something that can be troubling. But when you're a journalist and you're working on a specific story over time, it's the relentlessness of it that can really wear you down. And I suppose, and this is me speaking personally too, you begin to recognize some changes in yourself psychologically. Cynicism would be one of the things for me. I'd see myself as somewhat as an idealist, generally speaking, but as I was covering more of these stories and the kind of despair and horrific violence and all this, that sense of cynicism starts to grow on you. These are the things you kind of have to watch out for individually. Cynicism, hopelessness, dreading work, extreme sensitivity to violence. And definitely experienced that myself. I mean, covering the Syrian civil war, I remember I was having recurring nightmares about huge explosions in being there and experiencing it firsthand in these nightmares, and it had a psychological impact. And I suppose I was struggling to understand that too. But as a manager, I think it's even more important when you are managing a team of people that you recognize those signs in other people too. And I suppose creating an open culture was something we tried to do at Storyful. Certainly, I hope I tried to do with the staff that I worked with. And by that I mean being explicit about what the job entails, even at the interview process if you can, but certainly early on to people's roles. You are going to be exposed to this type of content. How do you feel about that? What do we need to take additional steps? Is there anything we can do to help you? We're trying to rotate and rest staff so they're not only covering a specific story. Obviously, you're going to have specialists on a team of journalists who are focused, for example, on the Middle East or conflict zones, and that's their specialty. But even though they might themselves think they're hardened to it, you have to be mindful that it's just not sustainable for someone to work on that kind of story day in, day out over a consistent period of time. You have to give some break, rest, rotation, if you can at all do it. If you can't rotate someone off the job, maybe there's ways you can offer them leave, additional leave, things like that. But it just has to be at the forefront of your minds, the challenges that these journalists are facing. I think creating a sense of value in the work is really important too. I think if you value the work that you do, it gives you a great sense of mission and a sense of purpose, and that makes you a little bit more resilient and makes you a little bit more capable of taking the challenges that you're facing with regards to vicarious trauma. So there's all these little things, and I think I learned them over time in Storyful that keep pushing the message that your team is doing good work. Maybe a lot of us don't do that enough. Highlight the good work that's done at company meetings, single out individuals for the good work they're doing, especially if they're working on something that's particularly grueling or difficult. Do what you can to register that with the whole company and make people feel valued and that their work is valued beyond the basic metrics, which unfortunately more and more now measure things by. So they're the things I learned, and look, we didn't do everything perfectly at Storyful, and I guess nobody does, but I think taking those steps to have that open culture, to highlight and reward good work when it happens, and to give people a break when you can, things like that are really important.
Really important. And I think you've highlighted some key parallels between what you would have been and your teams would have been exposed to as journalists and what content moderators face on a daily basis, and how you can apply some of the good learnings that you've had into the world of content moderation and the exposure to content from social media platforms. From your earlier days of working in this area and really figuring out what support was needed, what did you see was really beneficial that your teams were saying that was really helpful? I really benefited from this type of support. Did you have any particular insights around the support that really helped them the most?
I think probably one of the most important things, and certainly for me, and I think also for the teams that I worked with, was the peer support kind of network, the people that you have around you who are obviously going through the same kind of challenges, that are seeing the same type of content, exposed to it day in, day out. If you create a good team unit and you are surrounded by supportive people who work together, and you have that strong cohesive team, that's maybe the most important thing you can have in terms of support, because sometimes people unfortunately they're not comfortable speaking to their managers, or they're not maybe comfortable speaking to outside, psychologists or psychotherapists or anything like that. It's just something they may get to in time, but in a specific moment they might not be comfortable with that. So they depend on the person sitting next to them. They depend on their friends in the workplace. And I think it's important. Again, I go back to the idea of having an open culture around these issues. The conversation should start straight away when people come into the company. It should be explicit, and that should be from the top down, that look, we're worried about people's physical health, obviously, and we believe in place, but also just as important is people's mental health. And that's something we need to be open about. It's okay to talk about it. It's okay to say that I'm struggling today and I just can't cover this story today. These things are okay to do. And if you create that from the top down, I think it makes that peer support piece that much stronger, because people are going to feel comfortable. Okay, I'm going to turn to my colleague and say, "Well, I can't do this today. Can you help me out?" And we were really lucky in Storyful. I think we had a really, really good team, and I couldn't count the number of times that people turned to their colleagues and said, "I just can't do this thing today. Can you help me out? Can you step in for me today?" And almost always the answer was yes. That's really important. And I think if you don't have that, or if you haven't built that, or haven't made efforts to build that, you're going to have problems down the line, unfortunately. So I think that was probably one of the key things. I think there are other things, more formalized structures that I think obviously should be in place, like employment assistance programs and things like that, access to psychologists, bringing in outside experts to speak to the team. These are the more formal things that we did that did help. But obviously it's the informal day-to-day kind of supports that are the most important. And really that's built within a team and built by, again, an open culture, good team unit, good colleagues that you can rely on. And if you have that, really you're a long way of the way there to being in a good place to deal with these issues.
Thank you for sharing that. When I'm listening to you, it's the emphasis on creating a healthy structure and system that the individual is working in, and then providing the additional support should they need it. And I think that leadership piece is something which could easily be missed. And it's really good to hear you highlighting it and how it can help protect and raise resilience, as well as having someone that you can go and speak to, not be afraid to share that problem and say, I am struggling today, or I have been struggling for a while. Can we look at my work and can we try and work something around for a period of time so that I can still be a fruitful and, committed employee? So thank you. That's really interesting to hear you, as I said, reinforce those vital leadership and open communication and culture aspects, as well as
if I could say one thing as well, Davina, I think, and just to highlight, that was something we learned over time. And I think early on there was unfortunately, and I was guilty of this myself, a kind of macho, if you like, or it wasn't just male thing, but a macho, this doesn't bother me and I can deal with this. And, that kind of attitude certainly was prevalent in those early days. And it was only over time when we began to see the impacts it was having and recognizing in other people that culture began to change. I do think that kind of, for want of a better word, macho culture is still a problem in certain newsrooms, but I think it has to be recognized, identified, and changed if you're dealing with people who are dealing with this type of content day in, day out.
Really valid point there. It echoes a lot of what I myself have heard when speaking with content moderators, the sense of I'm fine, it doesn't affect me, but there is that accumulation that does occur over time. And we'll be talking to Dr. Marielle Barceval later on, so she'll be able to share some more of the effects that content moderation or exposure to content can have on an individual. And I think that point around it's a process of evolution. The culture needs to change. It's not just that acceptance that this is the work and we have to get used to it. It's really about understanding how the work can has potential for harm. And that's a great lead in now to Jackie as well, and just in the work that you're doing around the prevention of psychological harm in content moderation, and from your experience of working within broadcast as well. Jackie, are you able to talk to us a little bit about the psychological health and safety approach that you've been applying to content moderation work?
Of course, yes, thank you. So I specialise. I'm coming from a risk management background as a psychologist rather than clinical treatment. So I've always looked at this as identifying the potential harm, because that's really what risk is. It's the potential, and we're all different. So when we look at something like the issues that Joe's talked about, we can see that there is the potential of harm from viewing, particularly over time, this kind of content and reading. Sometimes it's the imagery, it's the videos, it's the sounds, it's the imagination turning words into realities. So all of those things, we do know they can have a negative impact on people. And we do also know, therefore, that can turn into sort of clinical symptoms such as vicarious trauma, PTSD. But a long way before we're worrying about clinical conditions, what we're actually looking at is just, what do we know about this exposure and what can we do about it far earlier on? And in that, there is a huge obligation on businesses themselves, not just because it's good business sense, it's morally the right thing to look after your employees, but because it's also legally, it's a legal compliance issue. Psychological health and safety in terms of stages of evolution is a long way behind physical health and safety, in that the initiatives around employee well-being and mental health are fantastic, and the last sort of decade it's exploded in all the right ways, but in certain areas. And so I tend to bring an approach of my own called the 4 Ps to help companies see where they are in this evolution, because none of those pieces are wrong. They're part of the picture, but sometimes what I do see is companies investing more and more and more in only particular parts of the whole. And what I mean by, so the 4 Ps is promotion of good health, well-being, resilience. And that's helping each of us as an employee to understand how to take the best care of ourselves in life and to make our bodies work well, our minds work well. And then we see a huge explosion in that around in workplaces, a lot of it through benefits, a lot of it through having speakers, all sorts of ways in which we can boost our well-being. And that sets a great foundation for us, whether we're in work or we're not. And it's seen by employers as just a really good thing to do for employees. It makes good sense. It helps us be more happy and productive at work. And it helps businesses' reputations, to do good things for them. And it's attractive to get the right talent in. There's all these things. The final P is provision of support and resources, and there's a huge emphasis there. That's where employee assistance programs primarily sit. They've got a bit of an overlap elsewhere, which I'll say more about, but providing counselling, usually it's an employee benefit. So it's for if I'm an employee, then I can go to that employee assistance program for some legal advice, some financial advice, some counselling. It's personal. It's not particularly for work-related issues. I can take whatever I want privately. It's a confidential benefit. It's not a core workplace intervention. So I will say more about that as well. But also in that final bit, we have first aiders, whether they're physical first aid, whether it's mental health first aid. But that final, it could be signposting to professional resources externally, having them brought in, as Joe said. But that last P is all about treating the effects of things that have happened now. I've been hurt. It may not be badly. It may be a small scratch in my psyche, but I'm treating it. So that first P and that last P are where mental health sits at the moment. Huge strides in mental health awareness, saying that it's okay to say you're not okay. It's okay to say you're struggling. And, leaders have got really on board with this, telling their personal stories. So welcome all of it. The middle 2 Ps, physical health and safety, has more work to do, like every industry, but is way down the road. And they are prevention of harm from avoidable risks and protection from harm from unavoidable risks. Unavoidable risks meaning if you're a journalist covering the Arab Spring, you're not going to completely avoid exposure to that material. However, there are aspects of how you're exposed and when and for how long that are avoidable. So that's the risk management piece. And we know in physical health and safety that anytime we join a company, we're likely to have an induction on health and safety. There are posters up. I tend to have them ready there are posters depending on what country you're in, that say to you as an employee, this is what your company has an obligation to do for you by law, which is to identify hazards, risk assess them, have control measures, give you training, have consultation processes. So we don't really see that happening up till very recently and about now for psychological hazards. And this is actually across any workplace, because all workplaces can be, we now know, especially through the pandemic, some of that's come to light more than ever. Going to work, whether you're still in your living room, can be hazardous to your health if that workplace hasn't got the right things in place to look after you. So the stage we're at in the evolution now, and there's a brand new global standard just come out, which is fabulous, because the law has always said what the law said. It's just that companies haven't quite known where to start or didn't realize they were supposed to, because of this emphasis on it's okay not to be okay, and let's do mental health awareness, which is the integral part of it, and emphasis on EAPs. If we've provided counselling, we've done what we needed to do, when that's actually an employee benefit. So what we're looking at now, and I find it helpful to talk about what's going on inside our minds, is it's not visible to others unless we're displaying behaviors outwardly or expressing emotions outwardly. So it can be harder to get our heads around what it looks like when someone's beginning to sustain psychological harm. Hence, we end up getting told to look for signs and symptoms of really quite severe conditions. What does it look like when I have PTSD? What does it look like when I'm deeply depressed? That matters in the same way that if we're dealing with a workplace with physical hazards in it, we want to know if we're handling chemicals. We want to know what a burn looks like so we can get to a doctor and get it treated, of course. But wouldn't it be way better that we try not to get burned in the first place? So, you know, if I was going to handle hazardous materials, there's an entire section of health and safety industry that is specialized in making sure that I've got the right risk assessments, control measures, personal protective equipment, avoidance of exposure that's unnecessary, the personal protective equipment, PPE. We're all way more familiar with that term since COVID. In physical health, could be anything from high-vis vests, hard hats, harnesses, suits, gloves, etc., guards on sharp things. So we don't get told, you know, in terms of physical health and safety, we don't get told, look, you're going to be dealing with a really sharp piece of machinery, try not to cut yourself. But tell you what, if you do, look for this amount of blood and go and get your first aid there. Here's how to spot if you've been cut. We make sure that people are trained to work with that piece of machinery very well in a skilled manner. We make sure they do have any PPE that's required. When we translate that to psychological hazards, it's so far not been well dealt with. And that's not all down to businesses. It's down to globally, they're not being the right experts in the right places to advise in the right way. And so this new standard is the first major step towards that. And someone like me and other types of psychologists and other professionals that can help businesses to understand that. And what it looks like, Joe's just led in beautifully with some of the examples where treatment of harm needs to be in there, because whatever we do, if we're doing risky things, harm can occur. But actually, a lot of the things you talk there, Joey, like they're buffers. They are known to be your own psychological PPE. It's like, what does that look like? There's loads of research that shows that being valued and feeling like you have agency, feeling that what you're doing has meaning and purpose, that you're an agent for good change, all of these are known to buffer against some of the negative effects. So it isn't a case of, if you see this many violent videos, the results will be that you have these symptoms. Right in the middle there you can see the same number of videos, but there are a whole bunch of things that are equipping you with your own PPE. And it's different for everyone to a point, but there are known ways in which we can support our own minds in a much more protective manner. So what we're looking at now is saying businesses can go quite a long way towards this. You talked about culture. The openness is a major start, the kind of safety to speak out. But that doesn't just apply to struggling. It also applies to saying, we feel, for example, I've worked with teams and social media companies who felt able to say, you know what, guys, we're dealing with an unusual spike in exposure to a certain kind of thing, and it's bothering us. It doesn't have to have caused reactions, symptoms yet. It's just bothering. And so things can be put in place really early. The business has a legal obligation. It's not just a nice to have, to identify foreseeable. You know, no business can look after my personal life in every single way, that whatever I've got going on, the whole contents of my mind and my history and my struggles and my challenges and what I'm doing when I go home. But what a business can do is say that from when the moment Jackie starts work, what is it that she could be exposed to that is foreseeably potentially harmful to her, and what do we do to get her the PPE at the right point in time, rather than just hope for the best and tell her to go to a counsellor. So businesses do have a big role to play, and leaders in particular, and employees have a role to play, just the same as in physical health and safety, where all employees are told you need to say when you've spotted a hazard, a spill on the floor, a loose electrical wire, like everyone, or to speak up when you feel there's been a near miss, or there's been something hazardous that hasn't been spotted, or the training isn't right. So we're getting there. Leaders at this point, at the moment, I see this explosion in the word well-being, wellness, and mental health is both brilliant and a little bit of a challenge, because it can be seen still that all of these things are a nice thing for businesses to do for their employees. And isn't it brilliant if they do it? But it doesn't really matter if it slips off the radar when other business interests become focused, priorities take over. And I've been inside companies as heading up wellbeing, and noticed how I can be really focused on by leaders and then really sidelined completely inadvertently, because it isn't seen as a core business imperative to do these things. It can be seen, for example, that it's very much the responsibility of HR and of benefits teams, instead of that, yes, it is them. And so that's kind of, we're at this beautiful big evolution is never a nice straight upward line. We have these great big leaps, and I think we're in the middle of a really lovely leap on this. But it does take a bit of a change in mindset that says this is a fundamental duty of care. It's core for business success, because if you hurt employees, they don't do a good job or they're not there. It's actually that simple. And it isn't just about, hey, we'll look after you because life's complicated and you might have difficulties or conditions or past histories. That's part of a broad mental health strategy. But this piece is, when you come to work, we will have done everything in our power to make sure you are not harmed by the work that you do for us, the workplace, the relationships, the exposure to whatever the hazards are. And that whole risk management piece is in various stages in different companies, but I would say that it's mostly new. I was fortunate when I went into the BBC a good number of years ago to have the opportunity to set a whole health and safety approach up, because it had come to light that not only were there journalists out there in incredibly physically dangerous places, there was also the beginnings of the user-generated content hubs, the people receiving the imagery. So right in parallel with social media, they're intricately linked. Content moderators are the people who keep our platform safe for users. So if they're fielding the things that nobody wants the users to see, it's because it's not very nice. So if it could be hazardous to me as a user, and the platform doesn't want it to land in front of me on my feed, then the people keeping me safe from it need to be kept safe. So that would be the kind of summary, that this is absolutely a core health and safety issue, which ties into a broader wellbeing strategy. But we need to stop seeing this as a nice thing to have, and putting too much onus on the employees to be more resilient, to go to EAPs in their own time, to make those things available, but to target and broadly to try to increase resilience. It's got to be that we match what we give these employees to what the nature of their work is, and allow them to be part of the process. Because Joe, you would know your response to the work, how it affects you, when it affects you, what your reactions are very personal to you. And only you know what's going on, before you get to work and after you've finished work, that plays into all of that. So that one bit that really deviates from the physical health and safety is companies can't do risk assessments for the employees. It's got to be with in a relationship. So I'm aware I've said a lot there, but that's the evolutionary journey, I think, at the moment. But we are at a huge moment of opportunity for this, to gather up all of the good stuff that's been learned and then take the next step.
So following on from that, Jackie, we've spoken a little bit about leadership, how it can look when it hasn't gone so well, but how does it look when it is going well, and how does that feed into team well-being and resilience in terms of the content that an individual is exposed to?
Yeah, that was a good question. So to start with the leadership piece, having leaders really say and demonstrate that it's core. It isn't something that will, when times are less pressured, we'll do as much wellbeing as we can, but that's going to get sidelined the minute there are, issues around business targets or times of increased pressure, really. So the umbrella term wellbeing is great, but psychological health and safety is when leaders will speak out and say, this is absolutely a business imperative for the reasons I'm about to say, and it's everybody's responsibility. That different people have different types of responsibility, whether it's HR, health and safety, senior leaders, line managers, individual employees. They're all those duties of care, but everyone's got to be part of this. So really, and what does that look like from a leader? Well, it's when that demonstrable commitment continues with resource, with being in meetings, with speaking out, with backing up someone in wellbeing saying this does need to happen and be put through business processes in this way, speaking out and saying, yes, it indeed does. You know, this is not something just to take on if you feel you've got enough time at the end of everything else. So there's that demonstration, which goes beyond leaders who quite rightly also say things like, I once have been burned out. It's okay not to be okay. I struggle too. That's part of the piece, but it's also the leadership demonstration that this is core. What are the benefits? Well, first and foremost, no business wants to hurt their employees when they're at work, right? So as well as supporting us all as human beings with complicated lives, and the blurring that the pandemic has caused has brought that to light more than ever, it's actually the fact that a business's entire success and reputation is based on a resilient workforce. If you have a resilient workforce, you have a resilient business. You also have a workforce who aren't taking disproportionate numbers of sick days and saying they have a stomach ache when they're really needing a time out because of the pressures at work. So having that culture, again, Joe touched on it, where people can speak up, and breaks, giving people time off for sure. But actually, again, to go to the physical health and safety analogy, if I'm handling hazardous chemicals, for example, or working from height, I do need breaks, because if I'm tired, I'm more likely to have an accident. However, as well as lots of breaks and being well rested, if I come back to working with chemicals and I still don't have any gloves on, however well rested I am, I still might burn myself. So on the job, there has to be a whole bunch of stuff as well as having the right breaks. So that demonstration is core through the company. The benefits are, there's so many that, you know, your reputationally going to attract really good people. When you've attracted them, they're going to stay because they're well and they're well looked after. And there's a great company culture. They in turn are going to attract more people in. You're not losing productivity through injury, illness, and just disengagement, lack of trust in the business. You know, it goes on and on. There's a lot of conversation when I do this about measurable outcomes, return on investment. And of course, that's important to businesses. If they're going to invest both money, time, resource, people, what are they getting back? Some of it is tangible, some of it's measurable, but some of it's not. And that's another thing businesses probably need to get their heads around, where there has to be a certain amount of faith that the relationship can't always be cause A, effect B, measure it in between. That's how much money we either just saved or made. There are these other benefits around tracking retention, tracking sickness absences where that's possible, because people don't always say why they're off. We just touched on that. A lot of physical health complaints are reported for actually mental health difficulties. But that culture piece that Joe talked about, if people can flag things earlier while they're in work, that the work itself is causing difficulties, then that's preempted, and that person may well stay engaged and stay in that role. And not need to take that time out and be more productive. Some of the measurable outcomes are really straightforward. And this is where I like to be clear that it's a legal imperative without that being the number one reason for doing this. We're doing it because we have to be legally compliant. That's both true, and it's a shame if that's the number one reason, rather than wanting a happy, resilient workforce that enjoy coming to work and don't feel in danger by what they do, or unable to say when they feel in danger by what they do. And feeling valued, that it matters enough that they're not getting hurt to keep them in work, rather than being, for example, disposable. If you're out the door, we'll get another one in, which also means the costs of recruitment processes are adding up and adding up and adding up. So there's all that stuff, but some of the measurable outcomes can be as simple and binary as legally compliant no versus legally compliant yes. Where would we be if we were audited by an outside authority, which is happening more and more, the health and safety authorities who are putting audits specifically around psychological health and safety. That does not mean, yes, we have resilience training, yes, we have an EAP, and we have a culture of speaking up. That's not outside, that's some of it, but that's not a full psychological health and safety. A full psychological health and safety has a huge number of aspects, but you may be reassured to know that many of your business processes are already set up to accommodate them. So that legal compliance issue can be an incredibly powerful measurable outcome. You know, last year we weren't legally compliant. now we're partially legally compliant, and next year we're going to be very much best in class legally compliant. So I think businesses can really gain from that. There's talk of having certification and other things, but certainly the new standard really helps people reach a benchmark, especially in global companies where laws and regulations can be so varied across different parts of the world. To say we've taken on a global standard, that means that there's a benchmark across the company to use these processes. So having all the right stakeholders. So yeah, the benefits are those and more, but ultimately I'd say it's a business imperative, it's a legal obligation, and it leads to incredibly happy employees.
Thanks,
sort of
Jackie.
what's not to like type of thing, really, except for, yes, there is a bit of a change in perspective, some investment in resources in the short term, but the long-term gains are enormous.
And it would be fair to say that just as they are long-term gains, we're not likely to see those measures be, come out after week one, where we might have other metrics that we can, pull very quickly. This is a whole culture change. And it will take time to see the benefits. But the really positive thing about this is that we're saying if an organization takes this psychological health and safety approach, before a new employee comes in and sees any part of content, they've risk assessed what the potential harms are and put in place measures to protect, mitigate, limit, or avoid. And I think the other benefit of this model is it bridges the language between psychologists, health and safety, occupational fields, and brings it all together. And I must include in that as well operational minded people as well. It just brings it all together to say we all understand a risk assessment. We all understand now what the potential harms are. And as you said, Jackie, it isn't just all graphic visual content. There's also potential for content which is read, and how that can accumulate and impact a person, and gives the employer a chance to create some space for those limits or controls to put in place. But it also leverages the workforce in that process as well. It pushes the responsibility and accountability for everyone working in that business. And if there is this risk assessment in place, it goes as far to say that you can lean on your teams to limit and to raise an issue when those risks are being or when they are coming to the fore of someone's workload. So you're basically ensuring that at every level of the business there is an individual who has been trained to understand and recognize when hazards are not being limited or prevented, and to flag to say we need support. And the really important thing with content moderation is this is not a static field. Content moderation is going to keep evolving. We're going to keep constantly seeing new types of content and themes emerge. And because social media platforms are user generated, they're based on what's happening in the real world. So if there is something happening across the world, we're getting it sometimes coming through the social media platforms before it has happened in the past, before it's even hit the mainstream news. So in the very worst case scenario, the content moderators may be the flag to say this isn't the usual type of content we're meant to be seeing. What is happening here? What do we need to do as a team to protect ourselves, to look after ourselves, and not just carry on working, going through the motions because it's the job.
And actually things around the content, we're concerned by the recent rapid number of new policy changes coming through, and sometimes that can get lost. Lots of different policy teams sending policies and not knowing the whole effect, particularly in the way that content moderators work. And it is that culture that if I'm a moderator, still having to say I'm struggling, which also I should be able to do if I am. So I feel like that I want to caveat that we're not losing any if we've got. But I can also be more like I'm reporting a health and safety concern. This isn't just about on me that I'm struggling today. This is me speaking up and that I feel like I would be welcomed in doing that. Like, thank you, I'd be thanked. Thank you for flagging something that now is probably going to help others, rather than, oh, bless you, you're struggling. It's on you. We'll look after you. But it's much more ownership, and that can feel scary for businesses to own that risk. But actually, the more that risk is owned, the more it's managed. And what I would say about the gains is, sure, yes, gains can be long-term in some ways. But what I actually all business process change, all new implementation, all change management, businesses do this all the time and know that there's an investment to be made, but do it because they know that the other side of that investment, there are all these really great reasons. And it's another reason to get past this whole, we're doing it because it's a nice thing to do, but actually, if that resource feels a bit much compared to other priorities, we'll just let it drop. No, it's an imperative. However, I have seen instant change where leaders have really started to engage and speak up. I've been really enabled in roles where I've been inside companies to come in and change this perspective and actually talk to the employees in a consultative way. Brings that really, I've seen an instant change where content moderators specifically have turned around and said, we feel seen, we feel actually like our voices matter, our concerns matter. It's not on us just to keep on being endlessly robust and resilient and then go and see a therapist if we need it. We're actually feeling like we're integral to this company's success, and now the nature of our work matters. And you do see an overnight change actually, because that means that engagement has lifted straight away. It's difficult to measure with numbers and graphs, but anyone in the business can feel it. And that's another benefit of health and safety as well, where if you are relying exclusively on something like an employee assistance program or a referral that is ultimately confidential, you don't know how many people are seeking help for what, when, and why between the personal and the work. When you have it as a health and safety issue that's embraced, I can speak up and say, I'm concerned about the exposure generally, but also mine. And any referral to help me manage that is out in the open. My manager knows because it's not on me. It doesn't have to be a source of stigma and shame. And the more that happens, and there's always a time for the confidential stuff too, don't get me wrong, but the more that this is part of an embedded health and safety process, the more the company has transparency on this. They know how many times health and safety concerns are being flagged. They know which control measures are working well and which ones aren't. Because I have seen cases where people have gone to EAPs and not had what they needed because it wasn't tailored to the nature of their work. And they've bounced back into the system feeling even more helpless. Because they're not sure who to ask and they're scared of saying anything. So it's all a double-edged sword. The benefits are absolutely core to an overall wellbeing strategy, but we've got to be very careful that health and safety is matched to the work.
Yeah, some very, very important points there. Thank you, Jackie. I'm going to go now just to see if there are any closing comments. Maybe Joe, to yourself first, and then bounce it across to Jackie.
Sure, and I suppose content moderation, that is something that's such an important part of our online experiences today that's kind of invisible. And it's something I do think about quite a lot, because as a journalist, in many respects, there's a much more tangible endpoint to our work. We have a published article or we have a video that comes out. We have something that we can show the world and be proud of. And with the content moderators, they often don't have that. And often what they're seeing in the world is negative coverage about errors that the platforms have made related to content, which I'm sure must hurt them because the job they do is so difficult. And I suppose we need to have a lot more respect for the work that is done and be more mindful about how we talk about the issue of content moderation. Ultimately, it's a human-led initiative. I know there's algorithms and things that support it, but a huge part of the content moderation ecosystem is the human-led interaction. And these people are doing probably the most difficult job in these companies. Often they're doing it, perhaps they're not even full-time employees of the companies, they're contractors. They don't have the same supports as a full-time employee of a Facebook, Twitter, etc. And they might not have those supports that they need. So, if social media is a public utility, and I do think it is, these are the people who keep the lights on, and I think that's so important. And I just want to make one last point as well, I suppose, about the pandemic and remote working. And this is something I experienced as a manager. I think I managed a team that was global. Obviously, I was based in Dublin, but we had colleagues working in New York and Sydney, Hong Kong at various points. And one of the hardest things I found to do was to manage the remote teams in a way that was consistent with how I managed the team that I saw day to day. And by that, I mean, when you're seeing someone day to day and you have a personal relationship with them, that is much stronger. You can identify signs and signals related to vicarious trauma and psychological harm much more easily when you're not seeing those people and they're working in other environments thousands of miles away in some cases. You don't have that line of sight. And as a result, it was a struggle for me at times, absolutely, to provide the same level of support to those remote workers as I did, hopefully, to the team I worked with day to day. So again, pandemic remote working, that's something that all managers have to be mindful of. Are you having that level of connection with your staff that you need to be having day to day? And ensure that they're safe, ensure that they're being looked after, whether you're an editor at a newspaper or working with teams of content moderators, wherever it is. But that's a new challenge that we're dealing with now, and a challenge I think that every manager is dealing with. And it's one we're going to have to learn more about, I think, in the coming years.
Very true. Thank you, Joe. And over to yourself, Jackie.
Yeah, largely to echo and build on what Joe just said, is I think that certainly when I've spoken with people, my own networks, about the work I've been doing, quite a few of them have a bit of a light bulb moment, because I don't think I know anyone that doesn't use some form of social media some of the time. Most of us are on it a lot of the time. Is almost that light bulb of just, oh goodness, yeah, like, is it not all artificial intelligence? There are people doing this. And I think that raising awareness helps, but in terms of businesses, the start point there is to far more publicly value this workforce, because we can see them, if we're a bit traditionally hierarchical, we see them as the bottom, but actually they're the front line. They're out there, to be a bit of a military analogy, but they're out there keeping the platform safe and working very, very high pressure roles. And it can, for them, feel very conveyor belt, very they can feel very devalued simply by the systems they're working through, even with no intent by leadership or managers to devalue them. There needs to be more visible valuing of them, that the company's reputation rests on the work they do, and that all the other sort of support behind the scenes is incredibly important. But this workforce are the ones doing it day in and day out. And we can't keep expecting that. We can't see them as disposable, that if they burn out, that if it gets too much, they disappear back out the door and we get another one in their place. There needs to be a way more valuing of them and investing in them. And actually, the final thing on that, to pick up on what Joe said earlier, is that when we talk about this integrated approach, yes, of course, health and safety professionals need to have the right systems in place. HR have a strong role to play in partnership. Leaders have a role to play. Employees have a role to play. Professional services have a role to play. Can be very expensive, let's be clear. Have their piece. Peer support is one of the biggest pieces that is talk about investment, that for a relatively small investment, making sure that we are all more skilled humans towards each other within the business has a major buffering effect towards how many people end up needing to go and seek professional support or essentially treatment for harm. And what I mean by that is, any one of us can be compassionate and caring, but the skill set can be things that we kind of don't know what we don't know until we think about it. So, for example, and we're not talking about training employees all to become counselling, first aiders, therapists. What we're looking at is saying, if I'm going to be a really good peer and colleague of Joe's, I need to know Joe, for one. And I agree with you that when we're remote working, how do we get to know each other? Again, businesses can value extra pieces of time for people to check in and do other things, but also I'm going to want to know when to listen empathically versus help problem solve when someone comes to me not feeling their best. And I've heard a team of content moderators who'd intuitively got used to asking someone, if they came saying, I need to chat, to say, do you want comfort or solutions? It's a beautifully simple way of saying, like, am I supposed to problem solve with you? Or am I supposed to say, oh, wow, that sounds awful? Because at different times, we can all be very skilled in being able to listen non-judgmentally, provide affirmation, really, validation, like, this is a tough job, no wonder you're having a bad day today, that sounds terrible. I know I would be too in my own way, versus sounds like you need a bit of coaching. I'm a big valuer of coaching skills. So not diving in and solving things for people, but having a slightly upskilled way of asking you questions, helping, Joe, if it was you, just helping you find your feet with what it is that's bothering you and where you might best get the right help and resource. So that really working with peer networks, the informal ones and the more formalized ones, is probably one of the most valuable investments a company can make along as part of the whole process. So really endorsing that, I suppose. Keeping our humanity.
Really important, especially during the pandemic, as we've seen.
Definitely.
Thank you both for being here with us today. Just to echo what you were saying there, Jackie, we're at a precipice of evolution here, but there are tools and there is guidance and there are ways in which we can look at making this industry and this work a lot safer for the people who are exposed to the content itself. But beyond that, it's looking at how we can keep the whole system healthy.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so thank you for sharing your insights, really valuable, and I'm sure it's going to resonate with a lot of the stories and experiences that our listeners have experienced themselves working in this industry. I'm now joined by Dr. Marielle Barsabal. She is a Californian licensed clinical psychologist, wellness professional, and artist. She specializes in the treatment of trauma, anxiety, life transition, and the psychological effects of living with chronic pain and illness. She's also most recently been working with content moderators and so is here to share her experience and her knowledge of the effect that content can have on individuals. Welcome, Marielle.
Thank you so much, Davina. I'm happy to be here.
So, Marielle, can you firstly start by talking us through what vicarious trauma is and the potential impact on an individual?
So the domains that we tend to see the impact of vicarious trauma are in the realms of our physical and our mental health, in our home lives and our work lives. The trauma is cumulative. It tends to build up over time. So sometimes it can catch people by surprise. And when it reaches a higher level of severity, it can even alter an individual's character and their belief systems. So, with that being said, it is really important to equip content moderators with the knowledge and the tools to recognize if they're impacted by vicarious trauma, and really give them a foundation in which they can start to address it.
Thanks, Marielle. And it's really interesting that you talk about that accumulation process of vicarious trauma, because oftentimes when we're working with content moderators, I know this is a common bit of feedback that we get, where people will say, I'm fine, I can cope with the content, and then all of a sudden, for the individual and out of the blue, maybe for their peers and team leaders, there's a very intense reaction. So I'm wondering if, team leaders listening to this or a content moderator themselves, what signs and symptoms should they be looking for?
Absolutely. Yes. So we're going to start by looking at how vicarious trauma can manifest for a person personally. And I'm going to talk about the different levels. So you might look for physical symptoms and some of these symptoms might look like anxiety. Or depression. So something you might be looking for is like rapid breathing, possibly more headaches, feeling fatigued, achy. Emotionally, one may be feeling powerless, numb, anxiety, guilty, angry. And there are a couple concepts, terms within vicarious trauma research. And these concepts can also manifest as a result of vicarious trauma, and that would be compassion fatigue, or also known as empathic strain. And basically what that is if as a content moderator, you are reviewing copious amounts of content, and again, a lot of the content could be particularly disturbing, especially depending on theme. And after being exposed to it so much, and then perhaps not being fully aware of the cumulative impact of the vicarious trauma, one might grow numb or desensitized to disturbing themes and content, and maybe even might start to feel as if they maybe they don't care, or they don't have like the same amount of empathy or compassion for the person who is suffering. It can look like that also in other fields where you have first responders who are taking care of people who are going through traumatic experiences, and the effect is also one starts to feel numb, and that is definitely I think a very important sign to look for. because it can affect your relationships. It really affects the quality of your life. Let's see what else. Also, less tolerance for stress. You may find that people who are impacted by vicarious trauma are just really feeling overwhelmed and unable to cope with the stress in their lives, even like with like things that are not typically stressful. They find that their coping mechanisms are not working for them anymore. A couple of there are a lot of signs to look for, so I might be listing a lot right now. Behaviorally, one might be more irritable, your sleep might be impacted, you might be more moody or easily startled. This is in the spiritual realm, this is interesting. I think these are also profound effects of vicarious trauma that one might notice. One might be questioning their purpose in life or the purpose of life, questioning goodness versus evil and feeling disillusioned with the world. I think these are like bigger existential crises that can come about with vicarious trauma. Even questioning one's spiritual and religious beliefs, I think are pretty profound impacts of vicarious trauma. Cognitively, on the thinking level, a person may feel like they can't concentrate anymore, that their thinking is foggy. They might be more cynical, pessimistic. They might even find that they are preoccupied with traumatic imagery and, possibly experiencing flashbacks or intrusive thoughts about, the content or the content theme that they're being exposed to. And I think what's important here, and we're not going to focus on this as much in our session today, but there's also a phenomenon called secondary traumatic stress, which is related to vicarious trauma, but it's slightly different. And secondary traumatic stress is going to kind of mimic a post-traumatic stress disorder. So that is something that can also happen in addition to vicarious trauma. And then relationally, you might find that a person becomes withdrawn. They feel disconnected from their family members, from their partners. They may isolate themselves. They may be fighting more or projecting more with the people around them, and also really struggling with their trust. So personally, these are signs that a person or an employer, might notice with a content moderator who is being impacted by vicarious trauma.
Thank you for going through that really thorough list. I think what is, what I'm picking up on here, and just from the experience that we've both had of working in this industry, is that it's a whole bodily experience to the content. And just coming back to that accumulation piece, it's really important then to understand how is the work ordered, how is it delivered, what are the exposure times, given that we work 8.5 hours a day, and just linking into the psychological health and safety that we'll be speaking about with Jackie. So I think all of those things are really important, but I'm interested also to know what else can be done to help people either recover, prevent, or transform this accumulation of vicarious trauma.
Yeah, so there are things to be done to help content moderators recover and transform the accumulation of vicarious trauma. So there are the concepts of vicarious resilience and compassion satisfaction. These are two important terms in vicarious trauma research. And so vicarious resilience and compassion satisfaction, these are antidotes to vicarious trauma. So, as we discussed, it's inevitable that content moderators at some point will be impacted by the accumulation of vicarious trauma to some degree through, their work reviewing graphic content. And content moderators can be taught ways in which they can cultivate vicarious resilience. So one can actually cultivate resilience and transform trauma by striving to spotlight those who are healing and striving for positive change, who have endured their own trauma. So really encouraging content moderators to be on the lookout for success stories, for the success stories of people who have endured trauma, who have put in the work to heal from it, and who have found themselves stronger, more connected, and living a fulfilled life after what they've experienced. This is something that's very helpful to help us transform our own trauma and the effects of trauma. So essentially, we want to help content moderators to build their own resilience through being inspired by the resilience of others. We can encourage content moderators to reflect on stories of hope and how these stories of hope informs their own story. We can encourage them to create their own story of hope and heroism, and encourage them to think about what kind of role that they would like to play in the bigger picture of social change. Help them to think through how they want to be helpers. And ultimately help them, to cultivate compassion satisfaction, which is the meaning and purpose that we derive from helping others through our work and contributing to a greater cause.
All really important things there to note, because we know that content moderation is constantly evolving, but it doesn't seem to be going away. So with that, we're going to have the continued exposure of suffering to content moderators. And I'm wondering as well if you'd be able to share with us some of the research around how that affects someone's worldview.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a really great quote by Rachel Remen, and the quote is, "The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet." So it's inevitable that, when we are exposed to trauma, that we will be impacted by it. We are human. So with that being said, trauma can really change us, even if we're experiencing it indirectly. And I think a way that we can all connect with that is that, the years 2020 and 2021 have shown us this concept that I think a lot of us have possibly changed in some ways. Some of us find ourselves to be different after dealing with so many compounding global crises in these past 2 years. We might find that we view life differently, that we see others differently. We might even see ourselves differently. Some of us may have shifted around our perceptions of mortality, health, trust, spirituality, injustice, relationships, etc.
And Marielle, we provide counselling. Yourself, you sit with content moderators and you provide those counselling sessions to individuals who need them. What are the benefits of having that counselling service available to content moderators?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Counseling is very important here because, again, content moderators are being exposed to copious amounts of content and graphic images and just and disturbing themes, and seeking counseling will be a really helpful way to share their experiences, to process any emotions that come up for them. If through their own self-awareness or through psychoeducation that they become aware that they are experiencing the impacts of vicarious trauma, with a mental health professional, this is probably the most effective and safest route for a content moderator to address these impacts. And I think what's also really important here is that the therapist or the counselor that they work with has a specialty in treating trauma. That's important too, because there are very specific techniques that are used to help people process their trauma effectively, and also ultimately to regulate their nervous system, which is, you know, the nervous system is deeply impacted by trauma. So essentially you want a therapist who's knowledgeable in this. And these techniques as well can be discussed through psychoeducation, but I think is most effectively guided by a mental health professional.
Exactly. And I think the key thing here as well is for organizations to hear is that support should definitely still be there, but we don't want to rely on it as the only source of support for content moderators. We want to try and front load it and see what we can do to prevent as much harm from occurring in the first place. So we're always going to have this need for counseling, you know, even when we think about crisis and escalations and things that we're just not expecting, and things that may affect us more deeply and more profoundly than other bits of content. That support is so key to having it available when an individual is in work. They can access it at a time when they need it the most, rather than having to search for that support and find a person. And we know how long it can be to find someone, or just the barriers that come up in seeking support. So exactly as you're saying, having a trained professional to guide you through this process, and a safe sounding board in a confidential space is so beneficial.
Absolutely.
And Marielle, in regards to the individual experience of vicarious trauma that you've led us through, it'd be fair to say that there's still a realm of performance changes that may occur. Are you able to share with us some of the ways in which someone's performance may be impacted by the effect of vicarious trauma?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, so vicarious trauma can definitely affect a person professionally and how they operate at work. So here are some of the things that you might want to look for, or an employer might want to look for in their staff member. So in terms of performance, you might find your staff has a decrease in quality or quantity of work. It's kind of like the signs of burnout, essentially, because that's probably going to be happening simultaneously with the vicarious trauma. Low motivation, avoiding tasks. Maybe they are burying themselves in work and working too hard. You know, finding that they can't focus or pay attention, and they're forgetful. You might find that morale tends to be lower. There's less interest and engagement, maybe like apathy or negative attitude. You might find that staff feel undervalued and unappreciated and disconnected from the work. And like we had mentioned previously, maybe they have compassion fatigue and they're really just not feeling connected to the work anymore, or the people that they're serving. Relationally, you might find the staff to be detached and withdrawn from coworkers, not communicating as well, or maybe even, you know, getting into arguments or tensions building between coworkers, and just generally more intolerant towards their colleagues. And then behaviorally, an employer might look for a person calling out sick more. Perhaps they're arriving late, they're not delivering on their tasks, and just general poor follow through.
And we spoke earlier about the need to give people the training to recognize these sometimes very subtle changes in their own presentation. And just on that, you know, the role of psychoeducation and content moderation is very important in helping people to understand their experience and potentially manage their symptoms. What else have you seen? How else have you seen that psychoeducation has helped content moderators in their work?
Oh yeah, psychoeducation is really important here. because through this we can provide information about vicarious trauma. We can educate them on what it is, what to look for, how it feels, and then ultimately what to do about it. And by providing content moderators with this information via psychoeducation, it can really empower them to put a face to the name of what they might be experiencing, if they are experiencing vicarious trauma. So with that, they can learn and really put tools to use to recognize if they're impacted by trauma, or perhaps maybe even experiencing secondary trauma, which we had talked about earlier, which is sort of like a more severe form of it's related to vicarious trauma, but like sort of like a step up, and have some preliminary tools to address it. And not only that, through psychoeducation, content moderators will have the awareness to also know that they can utilize other resources such as therapy, and have a mental health professional really guide them through their experience and really help them to process all of their feelings and really all of like the trauma that they carry around what they've been exposed to.
And lastly then, Marielle, are there any vulnerability or risk factors which may predispose someone to developing vicarious trauma?
Yeah, for sure. There are definitely some important risk factors to consider with vicarious trauma. So we want to be very mindful of our emotional and physiological reactions to traumatic stimuli that actually may irritate our own past experiences with trauma. So in that sense, if we have endured our own traumas, that puts us at higher risk for developing vicarious trauma. So in that sense, we are predisposed to vicarious trauma. Or even, like I had mentioned previously, or even secondary traumatic stress, which looks similar to PTSD. And here are some other risk factors. So, and this information has been provided by the Office for Victims of Crime. And here's a really helpful list of common risk factors to look for or to consider in vicarious trauma. So like I had mentioned just recently, prior traumatic experiences predispose us to vicarious trauma. If we are socially isolated, whether it's in our personal lives or at work, just in general, if we are socially isolated, that predisposes us to vicarious trauma. Psychologically, if we have a tendency to avoid feelings, withdraw, or project blame onto others in stressful situations, that kind of psychological structure predisposes us to vicarious trauma. On the job, if there's lack of preparation or orientation and training and supervision, that can predispose a worker to vicarious trauma on the job. Being a newer employee and just less experienced at their job, and with constant and intense exposure to trauma with little or no variation in their work tasks, this can predispose a person to vicarious trauma. And lastly, lack of an effective and supportive infrastructure for discussing traumatic content of the work. This can predispose a worker to vicarious trauma if that support and process is not, if that is lacking or doesn't exist in the organization.
So I think that's really key. There are inherent perhaps experiences that we have at an individual level which may predispose us to vicarious trauma. However, there are clear organizational, systemic, structural factors which can either exacerbate or, with the right support and infrastructure in place, can help minimize and prevent, which is one of the key themes that we've been looking at in today's webinar. Rethinking the treatment and the support side are given to content moderators, and going one step beyond that and saying, well, how can we prevent the harm from occurring? And when you're listing out the performance changes, the individual changes, and the organization, and how that can actually help lift and strengthen and in essence create organizational resilience, there's real merit to be looked at here when we're thinking about how can we change the whole system in which that content moderator works, so that they can be a productive member of the team, they can grow and be nurtured in their role, they can find meaning in their work through understanding their purpose of being in their role, as well as the good news stories that we always emphasize should be shared. And then bring it back to the individual level. That self-awareness piece is really key. How am I feeling in the moment? What else do I need? Or how am I changing? Am I reacting rather than responding? Am I less tolerant of others? And then having the tools to maybe to look after themselves a bit more, to provide some time to transform this accumulation of vicarious trauma, but also to say when it's getting too much, and being able to stick their hands up and speak to a team leader or a member of HR, just to see, is there anything that can be changed, maybe short term even, just to reduce their exposure so that they may recover, but it doesn't require them to leave the workplace due to absence necessarily or sickness. So there's some great things that we've touched on there, Marielle. Really thank you for coming on today and sharing your experience, because a lot of it I can hear resonated in the conversations that you and I would have had with content moderators, and how the work has impacted, whether positive or negative, and thinking around the bigger picture to supporting content moderators long term in their roles. So thank you very much for being here with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Davina.
So thank you everyone for joining us today. We've covered a lot in this session, and in honesty, it is just the tip of the iceberg. There's still so much more that can be discussed. So as I mentioned at the beginning, if anyone does want to reach out for any questions, please do not hesitate to contact myself, davina@zevohealth.com. Today we've covered the whole spectrum of wellbeing support, and expanded it beyond the current model that is in place in terms of the provision of wellbeing services, which encompasses counselling as well as training and peer support services, to name just a few. So now we're really looking at how we can drive the evolution of the content moderation industry to provide a much more robust model for health and well-being, as well as better ways to manage and mitigate against risk. So in the beginning, we heard from Dr. Jackie Wilmhurst, who spoke about the psychological health and safety and how that model can be integrated into content moderation industries. We heard from Dr. Marielle Barsabel, who spoke about the need for the ongoing provision of services, but also looked at the support given to an individual when they maybe do experience illness or injury from the content that they're exposed to. And lastly, we heard some great insights from Joe Galvin from his work from his work in Storyful, and all the ways in which they had learned and adapted. We're now at a point where we can take those years of all our experiences and bring them together to provide a much more robust model of working. Of course, it will require a change, but there are models and frameworks in place to support. And in addition to that, we've had some great guest speakers who really know what they're talking about. So we hope this has been really insightful for you today. Thank you for listening.